Welcome. This is Jen, the Liberty Lion. Today I want to talk about the Texas Hill Country, the flooding that's occurred in Flash Flood Alley up near Kerr County. And I want to talk about what happened in this area. So far, there's been 131 bodies recovered, and they're expecting to find several more, if not dozens more, over the coming weeks. Flash Flood Alley has a long and tragic history of major flooding events along the Guadalupe River and other nearby rivers. The river has flooded nearly once every decade over the last 100 years. The weather and the sky. Just before the flooding in the hill country of central Texas, there were several factors that played a part in what has become one of the most deadliest flooding events in Texas. So it's a hurricane, Hurricane Barry, forming in the Gulf of America that eventually died out over Mexico. As Tropical Storm Barry moved over Mexico, it brought moisture into the southern part of Texas. The system stalled over the Texas Hill Country, and as the system swirled, it sucked in more moisture. Some have said that it looked like a hurricane was forming over the land in what is known as Flood Alley. Tropical Storm Barry hit Mexico and traveled somewhat inland and then up north along the mountainside. Tropical storms like these don't go over the mountains, instead, they travel north. As it traveled north into Texas, it came to a low pressure system called a megascale convective vortex. Once it hit this area, it split, and part of it went east and part of it went west. The eastern part hung out over central Texas and swirled in a vortex motion due to the low sitting up north. 12 to 18 hours before the rain began creating the flood, the National Weather Service and others could see that some type of huge event was going to happen. The National Weather Service sent out a flood watch at 1:18 in the afternoon on Wednesday, the 3rd of July, 2025. The day moved on, but the system over Flash Flood Alley stayed. At 4:03 in the morning of July 4th, 2025, a flash flood emergency was issued. A few minutes later, the flood hit the area of Hunt, Texas. The vortex motion created sort of like a mini hurricane over the land. As the rain came down, the North and South Guadalupe rivers merged at Hunt, Texas, and major flooding began to occur. The alley stretches from Dallas to San Antonio and encompasses the Colorado and Guadalupe River basins. Carlos Javier Martinez, a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, told ABC News. Hydrology and topography. Once the water hits the ground, where is it going to go? It runs downhill off the sides of rocks and cliffs. It collects in small streams, and the water continues to run to the lowest point. That lowest point in the hill country is Flood Valley or the Guadalupe River. Add in the factor of the ground being mostly rock and shallow soil, the water did not get absorbed into the ground. It simply violently continued to seek out the lowest point. The Guadalupe River in Kerrville, Texas, surged more than 22 feet in hours. The calm, shallow section of the river in central Texas rose dramatically in the early hours of July 4th, cresting above major flood stage after torrential rains. Some in the Mystic area, Camp Mystic of Hunt, said that it rose 30 feet in 30 minutes. When the flooding began, there were two walls of water careening down the rivers. One was the South Guadalupe River, and the other was Cypress Creek. When these two walls of water met, it created a sort of super wall of water that swirled around Camp Mystic cabins where the young girls were staying. Reporters stated that Camp Mystic sits in a low spot on the South Guadalupe River, and that in the matter of minutes, more than 100 billion gallons of water fell on the camp, which is more than what falls from Niagara Falls in a day. By 3 a.m., the river had risen over 30 feet. In addition, places like Hunt and Kerr counties are situated on a floodplain between tall, rugged hills that funnel any rainfall down into the rivers and creeks below. In this event, the extreme rainfall funneled into the Guadalupe River, which led to the rapid rise in water levels. An elevation map by the United States shows the twin cabins in Bubble Inn, the cabins the little girls were staying at that didn't make it out, is at 1,857 foot. The Guadalupe River Basin is one of the three most dangerous regions in the country for flash floods, according to the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. Now let's look at a few specifics about Camp Mystic. So you can easily understand the location of what we're talking about and where we're talking about. There were two Camp Mystics. There was Camp Mystic Guadalupe and Camp Mystic Cypress Lake. Camp Mystic Guadalupe is on the Guadalupe River and is where the old camp was built 100 years ago. Some of these cabins were a little bit newer. Some of them were older, but generally Camp Mystic Guadalupe is the older camp, and Camp Mystic Cypress Lake is the new camp. Camp Mystic Guadalupe is the camp where the young girls died. These young girls were staying in the building called Bubble Inn. Bubble Inn is a newer cabin, but is still older than the Cypress cabins. Camp Mystic Guadalupe was built in a flood zone. In 2011, FEMA put out a flood map that included the areas where the old camp was, including the newer buildings in that camp. In 2011, when FEMA put out the new flood map, Camp Mystic had buildings there that were now in a flood zone. And it's highly likely that because the camp buildings were in the new flood zone, Camp Mystic would not be able to acquire flood insurance or thought that the flood insurance might be too costly. FEMA also said that Camp Mystic buildings were at a high risk for flooding and that it was in a special high risk area, a special flood hazard area, which meant that it was required to have flood insurance and had to adhere to stricter building regulations. Since the FEMA map came out in 2011, which included Camp Mystic Guadalupe as a special flood hazard area, causing Camp Mystic to have to get flood insurance and required them to have stricter building regulations. Camp Mystic put in an application to have its buildings removed from the 2011 FEMA map. Applications were for 2013, 2019, and 2020, and the application to have those buildings removed from the FEMA map was approved by FEMA. Hunt, the location where Camp Mystic was located near, is in Kerr County. Kerr County is a community participating in the National Flood Program. The National Flood Insurance Program is managed by FEMA. As part of the application process to have buildings removed from the FEMA map, Camp Mystic had to get a survey and have the elevation of the buildings certified on an elevation certificate. FEMA approves almost 90% of flood map amendment requests. Sarah Pillay is an associate professor of the political science department at Syracuse University. She has a PhD from the University of Washington. WVTV 13 says that Sarah Prale says it was particularly disturbing that a camp responsible for so many young people would receive exemptions from basic flood regulation. And quote, it's a mystery to me why they weren't taking proactive steps to move structures away from the risk, let alone challenging what seems like a very reasonable map that shows these structures were in the 100-year flood zone. Flash Flood Alley has a long and tragic history of major flooding events along the Guadalupe River and other nearby rivers. The river has flooded nearly once every decade over the past 100 years. The Kerr County Hazard Mitigation Plan was updated in 2024. Under floods, Section 1, Flood History, the Kerr County Mitigation Plan states the 2018 Kerr County HMAP reported 104 flood occurrences throughout the county from 1960 to 2016. An AI overview from Google says that on July 2nd, 2025, Camp Mystic in Hunt, Texas passed its annual state inspection, which includes an evaluation of its emergency procedures. This inspection was conducted by the Texas Department of State Health Services, DSHS, just 2 days before the devastating flash floods that impacted the area. The inspection confirmed that the camp had a qualified director, appropriate staff to camper ratios, and necessary emergency plans in place, according to KXAN Austin. The DSHS inspection included a review of the camp's emergency plans, including those for disaster situations, as required by the Texas Administrative Code. Inspectors checked for elements such as written plans, staff notification and training, and the presence of required emergency supplies like the first aid kits and flotation devices, according to fox4now.com. The inspection also covered other health and safety aspects, such as building codes, fire hazards, and life safety rules, according to reports from CBS News and KXAN. Despite the positive inspection results, the camp experienced a catastrophic flood just 2 days later, resulting in significant loss of life. The flood, which occurred on July 4th, was a result of heavy rainfall and rapidly rising waters in the Guadalupe River. The National Weather Service had issued a flood watch for the area on July 3rd, but it is unclear what actions were taken based on the warning. The event has raised questions about the camp's preparedness and the effectiveness of the emergency plans in place. Camp Mystic has been in the family of Mr. Richard Eastman for 50 to 80 years, I believe. And he was on site and managing director of Camp Mystic. He had one son who I believe was the cook, and another son who was managing the Cypress part of Camp Mystic. Mr. Eastland died trying to rescue the girls in Bubble Inn and possibly in the Twin Cabin. Since he's not here, he can't answer the questions that people are asking, and his wife has not been answering questions either. Jeff Carr, a representative for the Eastland family, said there was no way to know the magnitude of what was coming, no previous compatible experience. Mr. Eastland was not negligent. He states that Mr. Eastland was 70 years old and should be considered a hero. Here are some of the problems that occurred. Eastland began evacuating the camp almost 60 minutes after the warning came through. An evacuation plan should have stated at what point Mr. Eastland or representatives should have been ready to evacuate the children. The Weather Service put out several calls, put out several warnings, and even stated that it was an emergency and people needed to get out right away. But some of the roads were washed away. So the action plan that Eastland had should have included what to do in the event roads were washed away. While they were trying to evacuate children from the camp, it was raining heavily. Mr. Eastland and his employees should have also had an action to take in the event they had to evacuate in heavy rains. Camp Mystic was 6 miles from town. No resources to self-evacuate. Cabins, some of them were less than 500 feet from the river. They had a limited cell phone use policy, which meant that there were a lot of people, children, who had no way of getting a hold of their parents and no way for parents to get a hold of their children. They experienced a loss of electricity, which cut off the loudspeaker. Local governments are required to issue evacuation warnings, and the county did not issue a warning. The intention of my video here is not to place blame on any one person or group of people, nor is it the intention to place blame on any government entity. The intention is to point out that a list of failures occurred in protecting the people of the area, visitors, guests, campers, tourists, summer Texans, and residents. This includes the responsibility of each person taking individual responsibility. Responsibility is not something that can be passed from one person to the next. A person is always responsible, ultimately, for themselves, and parents are always responsible for their minor children. When a parent allows someone to guard or be a temporary guardian for their children, that person has a responsibility for that child, but only in certain respects. The parent's always and forever ultimately responsible. Purville and Hunt had a responsibility in certain aspects for the people within their local communities, and the county and the state also have theirs. This doesn't undo the responsibility that people ultimately have for themselves. The responsibility to act prudently when the situation calls. Responsibility is a hierarchical system. It's a chain of command, so to speak. Everyone has their part. Many failed in their parts, which makes this tragic event all the more perplexing. Okay, so I'm inserting this video into the clip here, the show, so that I can get a chance to talk about a few things as far as the Kerr County flooding. And most of you know, I worked for the government as a occupational safety and health specialist, and I did some work with the emergency management office doing emergency management work as essential personnel, which is basically a first responder, except for being in the field. I was in the office. So part of the problem that I've found looking into the Kerr County and Kerrville and Hunt and Ingram area, the flooding has to do with their lack of planning. And then they had an action plan and they had a hazard mitigation plan. However, when I looked through the action plan, um, it was kind of lacking, for a better word. It didn't have a lot of stuff in it that I think that they could have included in there that could have helped the employees and the supervisors figure out what their job was to do during the situation. So, not specifically talking about this event or these particular places, I just wanted to sort of mention a few things that have to do with planning for hazards, eliminating the hazards, and what actions that they can take during a hazardous event. So I don't know, the camera's kind of weird. I don't know how it's going to look when I post it, but I acknowledge that it's backwards, so it's just kind of weird. Uh, so an action plan, they have an action plan on their website, and most cities, at least the bigger ones, do have action plans. Now, action plans is something that you put in place once you have your hazard mitigation plan going. So, your hazard mitigation plan should list all the hazards um, involved in any kind of event particular to the area, but also some unforeseen things. And unforeseen things would be, for example, mass flooding. Um, so in Texas, we don't really have a lot of earthquakes. I think there's been a few, but uh, being or seeing as how the weather and all these weird things are happening in our lifetime, it's important to include some things like that. So they should start including also earthquakes. So this is something that one of the people was talking about, one of the media people were talking about when they did their investigation. They said that as far as Kirk County goes, it was the dispatcher could have um, put out the code red or sent out messages for people to start moving to higher ground, um, but only if it was something like a tornado. And next, they're probably going to say, well, this flooding was like a tornado, so it goes to the dispatcher and it was her fault or his fault. So um, I want to put that back on the head or the shoulders of the supervisors, because if the dispatcher didn't know that she could do that, then why didn't she know? And if she didn't know, it was probably due to a lack of training, which is the supervisor's job. So if a supervisor um, is not training the personnel and not making sure that the personnel are properly trained by performing drills, then that's on him or her. So, an action plan is what you do after you figure out what the hazards are. So, what type of hazards are we talking about? Well, we're talking about anything. Um, if there's a rodeo that you have once a year in your town, you would have a list of hazards that you could foresee involved. Um, with having a rodeo in your town. So, parking, traffic, breakdowns of vehicles, road closures, accidents, mass casualties, all these types of things. So, in any kind of event, um, you would go through and you would look at all the things that are going to be done. So, like, let's say there's a circus and they're going to have, or maybe not a circus, but some sort of festival where they have rides and stuff. When that when that circus or whatever it is comes to town, you would ask them, "Look, we need a list of all of your hazards, your hazardous mitigation plan." So they would have one, or they should have one. And if they don't have one, then you should have them get one before you let them come into your town and provide this service to your residents. Because if you're the mayor or the police chief or fire chief, you want to make sure that you're protecting the people of your town, including whoever comes into town from other towns or counties from other counties, so that you can ensure their safety. Because um, this goes back to ancient Rome, is that you want to provide the people of your city safety. um, you want to provide them commercial activities. You want to make sure that they're happy. You want to make sure that they're well fed, that nobody's starving, that there's not diseases and all these kinds of things, because it makes people want to come there. And then when people come there, you're building your city, and the whole purpose is sort of competition between cities to provide the safest, best place that people want to go to. And when they do that, when they want to go there, they have a loyalty to that place, and they say, "Oh, I'm from there. That's the best city in Texas, or the best county in Texas." Or, "Yeah, we want to go to Kerrville because their rivers are safe and they have a hazardous plan, they have a hazardous mitigation plan, they have action plans, they have regular mass casualty drills, and they do all these things, not to mention the stores and the ample parking space and uh, mass transit, so you can get up and down the river. Because a lot of people in the whole country, they'll float down the rivers and then they catch a ride and they go back up and then they float back down. And it's just like an all day thing. You take your inner tube, you take your ice chest, you get all your friends together and you kind of get together and you all just sort of float down the river together, drinking beer, soda and water, whatever, and just having a good time. So people take their radios along with them. And it's a big thing here in the hill country. So um, you look at all of the events in your area, and when you bring an event in from outside, you have to get their hazardous um, actions list. So whatever they're doing that's a hazard, and you want to look through it and make sure that they're tying their equipment down, their equipment's been inspected, anything that can catch fire, there's a fire extinguisher nearby, that they have designated smoking areas, that they have food area, whatever it is, you need to make sure that they are going to do their part, so that they're not giving your city a bad name when something goes wrong, that your residents don't get injured, that um anything. So you also want to bring in your fire department and your um, police officers to make sure that they're doing what their hazard mitigation plan says that they're going to do, so that they have the fire extinguishers, because you don't just take their word for it. They have the fire extinguishers. The fire extinguishers have been inspected. They're in good condition. That they are tying down their equipment, that they have a boundary line around their equipment, and like the fencing, so that people can't walk into a moving object, that their um, machines are properly guarded, and all of these things. Okay, so those are the actions you take. So you have a list of the hazards, and then you have a list of the actions you take to control those hazards to make sure that nobody gets hurt. And then in the event something does happen, you want to make sure that when the city has to come in and take control, that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. So the fact that some of these areas have natural attractions like the rivers, mountains, people want to climb mountains or rocks or whatever, they want to go camping, they want to go hunting, that they know what hazards are involved. So, for example, I know that in some places, if you're going to go out into a town and the town has a lake, like a big, huge lake, and everybody goes to this lake and they all fish and swim and jet ski and all these kind of things, that you give them a place to check in, let the check in people know what they're going to do, what they're going to be doing on the lake, what the weather conditions are. Um, what they need to have with them. So, like, everybody's required on this lake, because of the hazards involved in being on this lake, everyone's required to have a life jacket. Okay, so there's a particular lake that I know of, where we had to check in. Um, we given a list, a paper that told us what all the hazards are, what to do in the event of the hazard, what the alarms are, what the alarms mean, what to do when we hear the alarm, and the requirement to wear a life jacket on this lake. And the reason why was because this lake was in the mountains, and this was in California. And the winter times last longer, and there's often ice caps up on the mountains. So the wind comes down and it brings cold wind, and then the ice caps melt and puts more water or more runoff into the lake. And so conditions can kind of change from 1 minute to the next. And a lot of people, unfortunately, die while performing their activities in this lake. So this is the reason why they do this, to try to help people not get killed by doing something stupid on the lake. So the hazards are like things like high wind, and so the wind can come down off the mountains. It could pick up out just out of nowhere, and then it creates white caps, and people, get thrown out of their boats, off of their sea-doos. The water comes up over them while they're standing out there fishing, kids swimming and stuff. And so the requirement was that at all times you had to wear a life jacket. Okay, so I'm not buying it when someone says something like, well, this was completely unavoidable. We just didn't have the time. It happened so fast, for some purposes, okay, but when you know that there historically has been a hazard in an area that you're supposed to have control over, and somebody says, I don't want alarms because they're going to keep me up all night. That's not a justifiable reason to um, not have alarms. There is a definite, clear historical uh, event that happens in an area regularly, like every 10 years or so, then you need to prepare for it at all times. So, on this lake in California, where the wind can pick up randomly at any time during the year, they require people to wear life jackets every day, anytime they're in the water. So, I'm not suggesting that everybody have the same control over the hazard. I'm saying that not having any hazard control over something that you know for a fact can happen is irresponsible. And then saying, well, a dispatcher could have done this, they have the authority to do that. But you're saying that this was something that happened out of nowhere, nobody could have planned for it, it happened really fast. So even though some people got the warning, some people didn't, now you're going to say, well, the dispatcher could have done it. Um, shit rolls downhill, I guess. I think that's irresponsible. As far as now getting back to specifically Kirk County, Kerrville, Ingram Hunt, um, I think the responsibility lies on everyone involved. If you're a public servant, you have responsibilities. If you're an elected person, you have responsibilities. If you are a parent, you have responsibilities. If you're just a human being, you have responsibilities. So I think that there's a lot of responsibilities that lie on a lot of different people. And I think the clear answer is that they need to go over hazard, their hazards. They need to plan to eliminate the hazards through various types of actions. And from what I saw, it looked like their plans in some parts and their training and their documentation of the training and uh, drills must have been lacking because some people didn't know what to do. And then some people waited. And there should be training that if you feel like something is majorly wrong, it's better to be safe than sorry. Make the call, okay? Because you'll be in a lot more grief if you think you should have made the call, you didn't, and then people got hurt or worse. So, what you do is you take all your whole area and you list all of the hazards in that area, no matter what they are. It could be simple things like traffic, could be lack of personnel, could be like places like Kerr, Kerrville, and Ingram, where they have a huge influx of tourists during certain times. That can be a hazard. So, what are these tourists doing? Where are they going? Um, what problems do we foresee? And um, you take a list of all these hazards, and then you try to figure out what you can do to control them. So, for example, they might say everybody on the river has to wear a life jacket at all times. If you're on the river, if you're in the river, you have to wear a life jacket. I'm not suggesting they do that. I'm just saying that would be the control of one of the hazards. The alarm system, um, they could have had alarm systems. They can um, put out signs saying, if you're in the area, please subscribe to this uh, app or whatever in the event of a catastrophe. Were there signs out telling people this? Were people given when they enter um, certain roads or whatever? Are there signs? Are there like check in at the sheriff's department or, you know, call and tell us you're here? Or do they have the RV parks send them a list of all the people in their RV parks so that they can make sure that the people in the RV parks know what to do in the event of a hazard, what the alarms sound like, what to do in the event of this alarm, what to do in the event of that alarm. And those are the actions that they take to rid themselves of the hazards. Okay, so there's also when you get to your employees, your public servants, you have um, something like and it can be called different things like a job safety analysis or a hazard mitigation analysis for that particular employee. So that employee will have their own list of hazards involved with their job and what to do to stop that hazard. So if you're a firefighter, you have a lot of equipment to wear in a regular house fire. You have different equipment to wear in a chemical fire. You have um, different equipment to use or chemicals to use to put out different types of fires. So if the dispatcher didn't know what she was supposed to do, why didn't she? Who didn't make sure that she knew what she was supposed to do or what she could do in the event of certain hazards? This should be done in like a flip style book. And I don't know how dispatchers run. I don't know how police departments run. Um, so maybe they had that, maybe they didn't. But for the dispatchers, she should have had either a computer system to look at or a book to flip through so that she could see, okay, I'm getting calls that there's flooding from the fire department. I can take these steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and any order. Okay, put out the code red, call the mayor, call supervisor, you know, whatever. And those are the actions she would take. So these aren't just large scale things, these are things also involving just your work area. So, for example, to mitigate hazards such as personal body injuries, so I would do things like ergonomics assessments and set up people's desks and their computers and their phones and their chairs, their whole workstation to make sure that they didn't have injuries from having things out of place because there's a certain neutral position the body functions in more properly, and you want your workers to be in those kind of positions. So uh, small things like that, mopping the floor and putting out signs, electrical hazards in the office space, not to have to, these big, huge um, boards with all these plugs and you can plug a million things into them and things like that, welding, confined space, all those kinds of things, and they all have different processes and procedures and permits and things that you need to do in the event you are coming across a hazard, whether it be in the office, out of the office, mass casualty events. Now I gotta say that as far as response, I think they did pretty well. I don't think that they could have done much better other than having their alarm system out, other than telling people if you're going to be in the area, you're going to have to subscribe to this system of alarm. If you're going to stay the night, then you need to be on this system, and just make it a requirement. And even if they have to pay $1 or $2 to do it, if you want to come in our city and hang out and take advantage and have a good time and be safe, then this is what we need you to do. We need you to download this app, subscribe to these notifications, stay abreast, and if we send a notice out, then you need to adhere to what, as a guest, our policy is that you adhere to the notifications. Of course, this happened early in the morning hours, and a lot of people were asleep. They turn off their phone. I do. However, um, the only thing I have on my phone that I can do, I can turn off all my calls and texts and all the notifications. I leave the Amber Alerts on. So my phone is never my phone never makes a sound. It never rings. It never does anything except for the Amber Alerts. I get the Amber Alerts. I'll get them in the middle of the night, and the reason why is because children. I always want to know if there's a child being abducted around me, and if I can do anything, keep a lookout or whatever, or elderly people. So those kind of things can be set up at least on the iPhone. I don't know about the Android. Um, so these action plans can be cities, counties, families, neighborhoods, state, federal. They can be regional. The federal government, I think, responded well. They sent out notifications. The National Weather Service sent out notifications. The problem with the federal, as far as this disaster goes, I think, was with FEMA. And you heard me say earlier, they approved 90% of their applications to have things removed from the FEMA map, even if they're in a flood zone. The hazard mitigations, so I went into that a lot. You can use historical events like the past floods. I put in the video that Kerr County is well aware of the floods that have occurred in the past, and so they should have all been well trained, and they should have drills, and they should each person know what they're supposed to do in the event of a flood. So this was a really bad flood, but nonetheless it was still a flood, which happens in that area. I'm not saying that they could have saved everyone, that there's any possible way that they can save everyone. Some people are just going to do what they want to do, and they're not going to care. So you can do what you can do, right? And you can do a lot, and you should do everything you can. Okay, so they review their jobs, events, histories, possibilities, and set into place ways to reduce or eliminate the hazard, which is the actions that they take. So planning for a little flood does not really prepare anyone. So they say there's no way we could have known this type of thing was going to happen, but you always plan for the worst case. I'm not sure what they meant, when they said that it just happened out of nowhere and there's no way we could have planned for this. Well, you always plan for this. You always plan for the worst possible thing so that you can be prepared for the worst possible thing. And planning has to do with response, but what other counties are you going to call? Who would you call in those counties? What are their phone numbers? If you can't get a hold of that person, who can you get a hold of? Who's the next person? What's their phone number? What's their email? What's the job? What's their emergency manager? Who's their mayor? And you should have information on these people so that you can get a hold of them. You get a hold of them through their work number, their home number, their cell number, their work cell, their radio, anything. um Supplies, where are you going to get supplies from? Where are you going to get equipment from? Is the equipment locked up? If it's locked up, who has the keys? Can we get a hold of that person? If we can't get a hold of that person, who else can we get a hold of to get the keys out of the box, to open the gate, to get the equipment out so that we can get our boats in the water, get our firefighters out in the field, whatever it is. You have to plan for all of these. All of these things should be in the plan. Now, all of this you're not going to make public because you don't want the general public knowing, the mayor's home number. But all of this stuff should be written down for employees. So counties and states should be performing drills to test their plans to find problem areas or hazards they had not noticed before, unforeseen issues with timing and such. So there can be a lot of confusion during an event, and you come to find out, well, we don't know who's supposed to do that and who's supposed to do that. And I thought they were doing it, so I didn't do that. I went and did something else. Come to find out, I was supposed to do that. So drills are not a reason for um, getting upset with your employees or firing them or anything. Drills are for the purpose of finding the problems and fixing them. So any event is going to be chaotic, to some extent at least. You can't really prepare and have things in a mass casualty event. There's going to be some chaos, even just for the fact that people are having anxiety and they're trying to, stay calm in a horrible situation, and that causes people's stress to rise, and when their stress rises they tend not to be able to think clearly, and that's a fact. So uh, the more you drill, the more it gets people comfortable to some extent with what their job is during an event, and how to respond, how to talk on the radio, how to be clear, who's behind the computer, what to write, what to type in, how not to type too much and be too wordy, because you've got people out there that's now got to read this and try to figure out, what it is you're telling them to do and all these other things. So, um, yeah, I think that, not knowing all of it, not knowing, not being on the ground there at the time, not being an employee of the Kerr County, or doing a whole lot of investigating, I can say that I think that they could use some work with their communications and some um hazard mitigations and warning systems and all that. And I'm not saying anything that other people haven't said. I'm only adding explanations so that other people can better understand why having a hazard plan and an action plan for those hazards, or action plans for events, unforeseen events, or even foreseen events that are going to happen but you can't stop, how to get control of these things, or at least how to respond to them properly. So that's what I think that a lot of towns need to do, and counties and regions and states. And we also need to look at, why is FEMA approving um, changes to the maps and the flood zones on such a large scale. And when they do that, and then someone like, let's say, Camp Mystic had done that, and then they went to sell Camp Mystic, and then someone buys Camp Mystic thinking, oh, well, it's not in a flood zone. I looked at the FEMA map, only to have the next year FEMA come back and say, no, it's in the flood zone now. And it was in the flood zone, but they had an elevation certificate that they used to get it out of the flood zone, but then you come back and you have to do a survey, and then the surveyor's like, well, no, that's it's only, they have a margin of error, and it was within the margin of error, but it's actually in the flood zone because they were off by 2 feet. So I think these things need to be looked at. We need to start questioning, if you're not already questioning, why these things happen, what we can do to control them, and why are more places not prepared adequately, and what we can do, what is our part in all of this, like our family, our family plans. We need to plan as a family when we go on vacation, or we go to some holiday party, or whatever. Have some sort of understanding between you and your family that, look, if something happens, we're leaving. If a call comes out, if a warning comes out, I'm hooking my truck up to my trailer. I'm going to be ready to pull out. So when the next warning comes out, before it gets really bad, we're ready to go and we're ahead of the crowd. Okay, the third warning has come out. I'm pulling out and I'm going to higher ground. Um, I still have my spot. If they cancel it, then more people may have made it out. And I can't even fathom the parents of the children at Camp Mystic who lost their children. I hope that they can find some sort of relief when their children are returned home, and they can do with the body however they choose to. Losing a child, I think, is probably the worst pain ever. Okay, well, I'm going to include this in the video, and then I'm going to have a section where you can just see some of the aftermath and things that happened during the flood. So take care, everyone, and I'll catch you in the next video.
Tonight, new details on how the flooding and evacuation unfolded at Camp Mystic. Camp spokesperson tells the Washington Post Executive Director Dick Eastland did receive the urgent alert from the National Weather Service, but evacuations did not begin until about an hour later. 27 campers and counselors died when the camp was overtaken by floodwaters on July 4th as the Guadalupe rivers rose to historic heights. At Mystic, the problem was not just the rising Guadalupe River, but also a rising creek. Cypress Creek and the Guadalupe meet within the 725-acre camp. As the Post explains, the current from the creek was so fast, it likely reversed the flow of the Guadalupe River. This caused the floodwaters to widen and move uphill, reaching cabins both within and outside of areas in high-risk flood zones. It also created a swirl around Bubble Inn and the Twins cabins. Jeff Carr.
Shows you just how strong floodwaters are right now in Texas. That flooding began early Friday.
It wasn't even a trailer home, but they woke up to the water, like with their furniture floating in their house, like chest high, and pretty much just had to like try to get higher in the house, you know. They were trying to figure things out like within like a minute. And he said one of the windows broke, and he watched his wife and 2 daughters get sucked out of the window, and he crawled or like busted through the window himself, like dove through it, and was able to get on top of the roof of his house as it was basically just forcefully removed from the foundation. He said he surfed the roof of the house for a mile or two, and for the first 15 seconds he could hear them screaming and stuff. And I think they found him down the river. I don't know if it was the next day, but he did make it, and both of his daughters and wife passed away, and they still have not been found.